Hi everyone, my name's Ilona Millar and I'm a Special Counsel at Baker McKenzie in the Sydney Environmental Markets Group. Baker & McKenzie, for those of you who don't know us, are a global law firm with a leading climate change practice that has been running for almost 19 years now. We have been closely involved in the development of carbon markets and emissions trading schemes globally, and today I'm very pleased to be talking to you about some of the key issues around carbon accounts and risk management. One of the most important things when looking at corporate participation in carbon pricing schemes is understanding the legal and regulatory frameworks that apply to the operation of those schemes, and in particular to the collection of emissions data and the reporting of that data to regulators. In our experience, one of the key areas for and risks in respect of compliance with carbon pricing schemes is that the data that underpins those schemes is either inaccurate or incomplete. So we feel that it's very important for companies to put in place very strong data collection and data management systems to ensure that they're reporting to regulators on their emissions and energy use and production is accurately captured. Where a company has compliance obligations under a carbon pricing scheme, it's also important to understand what the ramifications are for failure to accurately capture and report on data. In some jurisdictions, there are quite severe penalties for companies for failing to accurately report on emissions data, which can include both monetary penalties and, in some cases, criminal liability. In many jurisdictions, this liability also reaches back to the directors of companies and therefore is very important to ensure that corporate groups get their emissions reporting right. One of the greatest risks with carbon emission pricing schemes and carbon accounting is getting the incorrect data or inaccurate data, because this obviously feeds into those compliance obligations. It's important when looking at the regulatory frameworks that govern carbon accounting for companies to understand, firstly, the level at which the reporting is taking place. Is it at a facility level or does it aggregate up to the corporate group? What is it that needs to be captured and reported on? This includes understanding the sectors that are covered by a reporting scheme and also the thresholds for reporting, as well as the gases and data that needs to be collected. It's also important to understand the process for reporting on data, the format it needs to be in, and the timeframes for delivering that information to regulators. In many instances, that capturing of data will be done on financial year bases, with reports submitted a few months after the end of the financial year. And so putting in place systems and processes to make sure that that data is collected throughout the year and in a timely manner makes it much easier to report at the end of the year and meet those compliance deadlines. We recommend, when developing and designing carbon accounting management systems, that companies put in place strong processes and procedures for the capture of data, the appointment of representatives who will take responsibility for engagement with regulators and submission of information to the regulators, and also making sure that senior executives in the company, who are often the ones responsible ultimately for submitting reports, are aware of their obligations and the timeframes involved. We also think it's really important for companies to develop strong and good working relationships with the regulators. By having an ongoing dialogue with the regulators, you can then work closely to identify some of the challenges in the technical reporting. Some industries and sectors have quite specific data collection methodologies and reporting methodologies that often need to be worked through and explained to regulators. So having a good working relationship with regulators can make it much easier to explain any potential discrepancies with reports, and also to ensure that that if there are potentially compliance issues down the line, you have an open and responsive way of engaging with the regulator to address those compliance issues. One example where we've seen this done really well is with one of the large mining companies that has a global footprint and is required to report on emissions in a number of jurisdictions. What this company has done in respect of its emissions reporting frameworks is put in place a system that clearly identifies the legal obligations in each jurisdiction. Then within the corporate group in each country against which emissions data is being reported against, the company has set up a very strong data collection framework which clearly sets out exactly what each member of the corporate group needs to collect in terms of the emissions data for each facility that is operated. The company has put in place authorised representatives to engage with the regulators and to take responsibility for reporting in each jurisdiction. And there has also been a process in which the capture of that data is done in a timely manner so that it's available for consolidation and ultimately reporting up through the corporate group. The senior executives of the company have been very active in understanding their obligations under the regulatory frameworks and also their responsibilities ultimately for signing off on reports, which means that the process of preparing the emissions reports has been embedded into the timelines and lead times to ensure that corporate directors are available to sign off on the data and information. What's worked really well with this company has been a process of annual review, so that each year in each jurisdiction, the company goes through a process of reviewing the operations at each of its facilities to see what's changed. Has there been changes to the corporate group or to the activities at each facility that might change their emissions reporting obligations, or do they need to collect information on more activities or less activities? Also, have there been changes to the regulatory framework that may impact on how they actually report in terms of changes to methods that might need to be applied for the capture of data, or changes to thresholds for reporting for particular sectors? So that's an example where a company has developed and designed a system that is both a data collection and technical system that interlinks with the regulatory frameworks, and a process-based approach which has clear lines of responsibility for reporting and ensures that the data collection is done accurately and on time. I think the key challenges for carbon risk management and emissions accounting come down to questions of understanding the legal and regulatory frameworks that apply to the company. In this respect, if companies are unclear about their legal obligations, this can create problems in terms of their meeting their compliance obligations. One really good example of this is something that we have seen here in Australia, where you have a number of companies that are new entrants to the renewable energy market, and as part of that they're fully across all of their obligations from an energy market perspective in terms of the capturing of information and compliance with regulatory frameworks. But because renewable energy of itself doesn't have significant greenhouse gas emissions, there have been instances where companies have failed to register and report under our greenhouse and energy reporting legislation, because that legislation not only covers emissions but also captures energy production and energy consumption. So by failing to recognise in the first instance that the legislation also covered their energy production, these companies were potentially at risk of failing to accurately register and report under that legislation on the basis that they didn't fully appreciate their obligation to do so. Another key challenge and risk in respect of emissions reporting is in respect of the accuracy and robustness of data collection and information. In this respect, it's really important that companies understand the technical detail of the material that needs to be collected. And in this respect, in many cases, the regulatory frameworks will have very, very clear guidance about the methods that need to be applied for accounting and data collection, and making sure that companies understand that and clearly specify the methods that are going to be applied for each source of emissions, and collect that data across all of their facilities will mean that the data collection can be accurate and robust. But if the information fails to meet the standards in the regulation, that's where you might be subject to audit. And in many schemes there are either mandatory or spot audits that can pick up inaccuracies in data and then lead to compliance action by regulators. A key risk is failure to complete the reporting processes in a timely manner. Most legislative schemes will specify dates for reporting, and failure to report by those due dates can then lead to penalties for non-compliance. In many instances, the dates for reporting are a number of months after the end of financial years, which is intended to give companies the time to work through the data that they've collected and then accurately report it. But because of the differences in alignment of those timeframes, it does become critical to make sure that companies are on top of those timeframes and report by the due deadlines. Where this becomes an issue is where you need to get executive level sign-off from corporate directors, and making sure that the information gets to them well in advance to enable them to consider and sign off on that information. So in summary, I think the main things to keep in mind when looking at the development of risk management frameworks for carbon accounting really come down to a couple of key points. Firstly, understand the legal and regulatory frameworks in which you're operating in, which may be across a number of jurisdictions, and those obligations may be found in a number of different pieces of legislation. Secondly, it's important to understand and delineate amongst the obligations of different corporate entities, particularly if you've got a broader corporate group, to understand what needs to be done at the facility level and what needs to be done at the corporate level. It's important to make sure you've got robust data management systems in place to collect data and to streamline and facilitate your reporting. And then be aware of the timeframes for reporting, and be aware of your compliance obligations. And then the final point is know your regulators and try and develop a good working relationship with them.